Okay, Bill and Allie, welcome to the podcast. Bill, welcome back. We're always trying to
Oh,
get you to
thank
come
you.
back, so this is great. And Allie, we're so excited to get to talk to you about something we know you're really passionate about and that at Faith Matters we've wanted to address for years, and I don't think we've done it on the podcast yet. So this is a big morning, and we're really excited to have you both.
Thank you.
Um, if
Thanks.
it's okay, Allie, I think it would be really great to hear your story right off the bat, to just hear how this has become a something that you have sort of anchored your life to. Are you open to just talking
Of
about
course.
how you started thinking about the word of wisdom?
Yeah, of course. So I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I have 6 young kids, and I never would have thought that this is what I would be doing. But on October 1st, 2019, I got one of those phone calls where something was terribly wrong with my husband. I wasn't sure what. His coworkers had been calling me multiple times. I was actually in the shower. And when I finally saw what was going on, they told me that he was on his way to the ER and for me to meet him there. So I luckily had a neighbor watch my kids, and I was able to, run over to the ER as fast as possible. I had no idea what to expect. All I knew is that my husband was saying there was something going on with his vision. And so I distinctly remember opening the ER door, scanning the room, looking for my 37-year-old husband. And he was in a wheelchair, he was slumped over, and he looked like he was 80 years old. And in my heart, right then, it was like, he looks like he's having a stroke. But, at first you're like, no, no, who knows what's going on? I don't know. I ran over to him, and he got incredibly emotional. He's like, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. When he was at work, he was just sitting at work like a normal day. And then all of a sudden he got double vision, and he just felt terrible. And he literally thought, I better leave my office, I think, because I don't want to die in my office alone. And so he got up, he went to, the assistant's office. He's an attorney in DC. And she looked at him and instantly had that same thought, like, whoa, he looks like he's having a stroke. But they rushed him to the ER. We weren't sure exactly what was going on. And it took hours and so many tests to really understand. And when we did, it was confirmed that, yes, he was having a stroke. But why was not clear. And, as a mom with 6 kids, we just had twin boys. I mean, they were like 8 months old, and they were number 5 and number 6. And my husband was a bishop, right? And he's an attorney. And so I'm asking the neurologist, I'm like, okay, but do you think this is stress? Like, do you think this is happening because of stress? And he looked at me so seriously, and he's like, no, this does not happen because of stress. There is something deeper underlying that's going on. Of course, stress can impact it, but there's something else here. And so we spent days in the hospital, days. And I thought that just miraculously we would wake up, and just like that, his vision would come back. The whole ward was praying for us and fasting for us, and he got a blessing, all of those things. But it didn't. And after tests, we were not given any more understanding of why someone so young, just 37 years old, would be having a stroke. There was no hole in his heart. There was no heart arrhythmia. There was no family history, no genetic aspect to any of this. And so, we had to sit down and meet with a dietitian, and they said, well, he's 37 years old. He's had a stroke. Because he's had one stroke, he's at a higher risk of having another stroke in his future. And so it is important, while we don't understand why, that you guys follow a heart healthy diet to minimize his risk in the future. And so they gave me this piece of paper, and they said, okay, here's a heart healthy diet. Number 1, avoid alcohol. And I'm thinking, well, duh, we have been doing that. Number 1, avoid alcohol. Number 2, avoid saturated fats. Number 3, avoid trans fats. Minimize your risk, minimize your consumption of cholesterol, and most importantly, to eat more fiber. And at the time I was like, okay, but what do I make for dinner? Like, what does this mean? How do I actually apply this? And I was a little confused. But I went home from the hospital, and I remember driving home, calling my mom to tell her what had happened. And I was just flooded with a memory of when she had called me during another traumatic event in her life. And that was when my father had had a heart attack. He was just 55 years old. And unfortunately, he didn't survive his one and only heart attack. It was a one and done, and he was gone. And when I got that phone call, I remember just breaking down on my knees, pleading, asking God, like, why? Like, why can't he have a second chance? Why can't he have a chance to change his diet, to do something different? But we didn't get that second chance. And so as I was talking to my mom, I realized my prayer had been answered in a different way than I thought, that we were given a second
Mm.
chance, a chance to change, a chance to, make these changes to minimize his risk of this happening in the future. And luckily my husband was still alive. My great grandma's husband passed away early when she was in her 40s. My grandma's husband passed away early when he was in
Wow.
his 60s. Yeah. And then my mom, in the 50s. And I was like, there's this pattern here. And I don't want to end up like my mom or my grandma or my great grandma. And the mama bear came through and I was like, I have to do something about this. And so as any, faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you go to the temple, you pray, you ask God, like, what do we need to be doing? I'm willing, like, I am surrendering it all. What do you need me to do? And the answer was so clear, as clear as day. It was to follow the word of wisdom completely, like completely. I was like, but wait, we are, according to the handbook, it says that you just have to avoid drinking alcohol and avoid doing drugs and, coffee and tea. And that's the word of wisdom, right? But as I actually opened up section 89 and read through verse by verse and took a serious look at the word of wisdom, I realized that we had been living kind of like the lower law of the word of wisdom,
Mm.
that there was so much more, that this revelation is rich with direction. And especially coming from someone who is so confused, like, who do I follow? What do I do? And it's right there. It gives clarity on what to do to really avoid, I would say, most early deaths. And so that's what started me on this journey, is to really understand not just the don'ts of the word of wisdom, but the do's. And once we, really prioritized eating more fiber, which is plants. Like at the time I was like, when we got the piece of paper from the dietitian in the hospital and they told us to eat more fiber, I was like, does this mean add more fiber one bars? Like, what does this mean? Is
Yeah.
it a fiber supplement? I don't understand. And then I began to understand that, oh, fiber only comes from plants. Like, we need to be eating more fruits and vegetables, whole grains and beans and legumes and all of those things. And one thing that is very overlooked in Doctrine and Covenants 89 is to eat meat sparingly. It's something that I remember thinking, like, why don't we ever really talk about that? And as you shift your focus, it almost like flips the plate of what the standard American diet is and flips it around so that you form your meal around the plants and maybe meat sparingly, instead of form the meal around the meat and then plants sparingly, right? It's kind of flips it. And as we did that, my husband, not only did his vision come back after 5 months, which it took time. It was not this miraculous overnight. It was a slow process. It did take time, but he lost weight without trying. His cholesterol improved significantly. His triglycerides improved. I mean, his blood pressure improved, everything. And I was like, we have this truth. I want to shout this from the rooftops. There is so much power and strength in really going past just the don'ts of the word of wisdom, but looking at it more as the do's.
Yeah.
And so that's what started me on this whole
Amazing.
process.
Wow. Thank you so much. That is the kind of story that activates me and that I feel grateful for not having lived firsthand, but it feels like such a powerful invitation. I think one of the things that makes the word of wisdom feel a little bit inaccessible to me is that it's very clear that it was given in a different time. And so I think it's easy to dismiss whatever doesn't ring true because we're like not sure what it's talking about, like vine grapes of the vine of your own make and eat meat in winter and famine and like just some things that like don't feel obviously like resonant with our regular life now. And so I think it's easy to digest it in the very simple checklist way that it's been given to us. So Bill, I want you to jump in here because you write really powerfully about the concept of revelation and the way revelation evolves over time, but is also that it's important to understand the context in which it was received and asked for. So can we just pause on what's actually there and just go back to how we got it in the first place?
Yeah, and Allie, maybe have your Doctrine and Covenants handy. I might ask you to read a verse or two, but first of all, I don't feel really super qualified to talk on this subject, but I have thought about this over the years and have written a bit about it. I think, I mean, DNC 89 really just kind of challenges to be more mindful about what we take into our bodies, if we want health and, knowledge and wisdom. But I think like a little context. First of all, Joseph was on sort of a prophetic role here, wasn't he? If you think about the last part of 1832 and the early part of 1833, we get DNC 84 with all these brilliant insights. On priesthood, we get Section 87 where he prophesies the Civil War, like just nails it, which is startling. We get 88, which is just so full of wisdom all over the place, and it's just uh, this beautiful revelation, and then this little short revelation on health, on this word of wisdom, uh, and uh, and it's stunning too for its prophetic insight, I think. Ali, maybe if you could read, would you mind
Yeah.
reading like the first three verses?
It says, a word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland and the church and also the saints in Zion, to be sent greeting not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and the will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days, given for a principle with a promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints, who are or can be called saints.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great intro. We all know the context, I think. You've got Joseph gathering these high priests, these men of God around him, and they're like spitting tobacco between between spouting wisdom and revelation. They're like spitting tobacco into a spittoon, and Emma and others are having to clean it up, and it's just like it's kind of disgusting. And and so Joseph's like, what is the disconnect here? What are we not getting? Like, how can we be men and women of God? Is really the men were the problem. I don't think women were doing this, but uh, my guess is anyway. So that's a kind of every revelation emerges from some simple question, and Joseph, as a prophet, had this way of just taking these little things that we encounter in daily life and then sort of expanding it into some greater, larger context. And that's exactly what happened here, and what he ended up with. Although he might be today, if he might be surprised at what we've done with it, but what he actually gave us was really quite extraordinary. And so what is it talks about? First of all, it's very it says this is given. What is the language again? Is a greeting and not by commandment, but as a word of wisdom.
Yeah.
It sounds
Mhm.
very invitational, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like toe the line here.
Yeah.
You know,
Explicitly not by commandment or constraint.
adapted is
Yes.
even adapted to the weakest among the saints. So let's don't make it too big a thing here. But
Mhm.
but there is wisdom here, and he invites us into this idea of being more mindful of what we take into our bodies, right? I think that's kind of what it is and what our relationship is with food and what we take into our bodies. So that's what
Mhm.
it feels like to me. And then the Lord doesn't really tell us the principle. He refers to a principle, but then I think we're to infer the principle from the
Mm.
examples that were given in the context of the people that it was given to. And we have to remember, like 200 years ago, things were just much different. They had some problems. Alcoholism was a big problem. The average person drank 3 times as much alcohol then as
Really?
we
Is
do
that
today.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was a big problem. And yeah, I think Joseph Smith Sr. may have had a little bit of a drinking problem. There's some indication. So Joseph had some context in his own family for that. Um, we uh, we know that tobacco had become sort of a problem, but cigarettes hadn't been invented yet. They wouldn't really
Right.
be invented till the Civil War. So tobacco was like more of a nuisance, and it was being discussed as a health problem, but we hadn't industrially weaponized tobacco quite
Mm.
yet. Those were probably the two main concerns. And then we can get into this, but then the revelation goes to food. It really goes after it addresses. But what should we just not skip over the warning part? I think it's actually really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
You want to just
still got
read
your
it
still got your D&C there.
verse
Read that.
in verse
Read verse
4?
4. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It says, behold, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation.
This part seems like strikingly prophetic to me. I don't know how
Yeah.
it feels to you. I
Mm.
don't think, like Joseph didn't know what was going to happen, for example, with the tobacco industry even with or the alcohol industry and how sort of a wedding of these industries with Madison Avenue eventually advertising, would
Wow.
would make tobacco a scourge
Mhm.
across America and across the world, and make alcohol so sexy and enticing. Cigarettes too. Couldn't have possibly known. Joseph couldn't have possibly known about opioids and drug gangs, and there are whole industries, including
Hmm.
maybe parts of our pharmaceutical industry and our food and ag industries
Yeah.
where they're mass producing and mass marketing things that they know are hurting us and killing us. And obviously we have epidemics of obesity and like all kinds of diseases. Well, this is a warning. Like keep your eye out for people who are putting profit over people.
Yeah.
So like that verse 4, we shouldn't just skip over that. And thinking,
Hmm.
I think it's been he, the Lord identifies like in these very early verses some things to stay away from.
Right.
Which maybe we can hop into that. But
Yeah.
if I just
I
think, yeah, go
I
ahead.
have I have one more just context question
Sure.
before we really dig into the meat of it all. I how do we go then from it's not by commandment, not by constraint, to you may miss your kids' ceiling if you are a regular coffee drinker. At what point
Mhm.
did these become temple recommend questions? Because
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
when it's sort of to me it feels like the checklist is solidified,
Yeah.
or at
Okay.
least
Yeah.
the revelation itself is solidified as a checklist in
Yeah.
Right.
our community consciousness.
It took us basically 100 years from the time the revelation was given until we actually decided, okay, what does this require of us? So like
Hmm.
institutionally, we created this is what you need. This is the part of it that you need to observe in order to be a good Latter-day Saint, to go to the temple, to serve, to do the things that serve a mission or have certain callings. Ultimately, over time, Lorenzo Snow began to feel some energy around like let's really define this, because what we've got a bunch of young people, especially who've been in, maybe you're the second, third generation in the Salt Lake Valley, and you've got these especially young men, smoking, doing a little drinking, and so he felt some urgency to take to take the word of wisdom more seriously. And for him, actually, not eating meat was sort of central. So
Mhm.
whereas for
Really?
Lorenzo Snow,
Yeah.
yeah, that was abstaining from consumption of meat. But he ultimately failed to convince Heber J. Grant and Joseph F. Smith. And when Lorenzo Snow was out of the picture when he died, they were more concerned with liquor consumption, tobacco, and tea and coffee. And so when Smith succeeded Snow as church president, abstinence from those substances began to be pushed in churchwide
Wow.
meetings and state conferences. And older members who had grown up without these sort of hard restrictions, they were given some leeway. But the younger saints were expected to start towing the line. And so in
Interesting.
1915, President Smith wrote that young or middle-aged men who have had experience in the church should not be ordained to the priesthood nor recommended to the privileges of the house of the Lord unless they will abstain from the use of tobacco and
Wow.
intoxicating.
That was a quote. Was that a
Yeah,
quote?
that's a quote. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so there you go.
And so these were also the years of the prohibition movement, which
And
clearly influenced the thinking of church leadership. And so coffee and tea weren't prohibited yet. But by the early 1930s, adherence to the word of wisdom, which became what we have now, like abstinence from coffee or alcohol, tobacco, coffee, and tea, became a requirement for temple recommend holders. And there's no revelation
wow.
on why that happened. It was sort of like a lot of deliberations, a lot of discussions, a lot of opinions on what the early brethren actually thought about certain things, including Joseph and Hiram.
Yeah.
And, by the way, that would be about the time that my grandfather became a second class Latter-day Saint.
Mm.
Because my grandfather, yeah, about the time that they drew that line, my grandfather was like a very active member of the church. Um, and very affable. Everybody loved the guy, but yeah, he'd picked up the with a lot of the young men of his era, had picked up the tobacco habit, and he could
Mm.
never kick it. It's a tough one to kick, actually. Tobacco's a tough one. I've been in. We were 12-step missionaries for a while, and I learned from a lot of addicts, even the hard drug addicts, that tobacco was actually the hardest one to kick. It's just a tough one.
Wow.
So maybe my grandpa was, maybe it wasn't adapted for the weakest of because he just couldn't kick that. And so
Yeah.
he went from being like a member in full fellowship to someone, he was still given church callings, but you know, couldn't hold a temple recommend. Kind of a sad story when my uncle when he got engaged, and this by this time my grandpa hadn't been to the temple in many years because he couldn't get in. But he went to his bishop and he said, I'd love to be at the temple for my son's wedding. How could I do that? And he says, I'll tell you what, this bishop was kind. He says, you know what? If you can quit for 2 weeks, I'll I'll give you a temple recommend. If you can agree to stop for 2 weeks, and gave him a temple recommend. And unfortunately, my grandpa passed away. He passed away the day before the wedding. They had the wedding without him and then came immediately up to bury him. So he never got to attend.
Oh my
But
gosh.
Wow.
that ceiling, I know it's a sadness that the family's kind of held for a
Mhm.
Yeah.
while. It's too bad. I think that I guess what is the great moral sin in smoking a cigarette? So that's
Wow.
yeah, but on the other hand, my father, when he converted the church, that requirement to not smoke, he was a smoker, and so he was able to quit, and thank goodness he was. I mean, my dad lived to a good ripe age, and he found it really difficult to quit smoking, but he did. So like, yeah, that's a two-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
When you think of health, there's a bunch of dominoes that you can always push down. You could exercise, you could do all these different things. But if there's going to be one big domino, like that will, if you push it down, it really will help. I think, two big dominoes. It really would be to abstain from alcohol and tobacco. I mean,
Mm.
there is literally no like healthy amount of alcohol that's good for your heart, your brain, your body. I live in Washington, D.C., and there was a plane crash here recently, and it made local news, made national news. All the people on the plane died. But if you actually look at the statistics for how many people die every single day in America from alcohol related activities, it's 2 planes worth of people every single day. And so that's something that it's, again, not making national headlines, but if you want to push over a big domino, really, minimizing your intake of alcohol and tobacco is just the foundation, like one of the best things that you can do. So I really do feel like it was inspired that they started saying, hey, and yes, it was during the prohibition, so this is definitely influenced by that time, but it is a big health domino that our society looks at like it's no big deal, a glass of wine at night to relax and unwind, but really you're stealing from your future self. You're stealing,
Yeah.
just years now for years later, that it is not health promoting in any way.
And think of all the health problems that we have, as a people, have avoided by just simply drawing that line.
Right.
Mhm.
Uh, Especially tobacco and alcohol, those two. There's nothing good about them. Yeah.
I want to know though, as the years have gone by and we could create another whole list of things that maybe would have been mentioned in the word of wisdom in our own time. It's tempting to just make the checklist a little more detailed and a little longer and clarify the things that feel out of context now. So I would love for either of you to just address the idea of an evolving revelation, because I think maybe you could hear this like, well, that sounds like a very specific question and a very specific answer for a very specific time, and it's not very relevant to my life right now. So if and which I think maybe is part of what can create this mindset of looking for a loophole. If it just feels so out of context and it's a list, if it's not really resonating in a deeper place, it can be easy to substitute a cup of coffee for a Red Bull and feel like great about that. But it doesn't feel like the answer can be that we just get more prescriptive about what needs to be on the list. So I think what maybe would be helpful is just I'd love to hear what you both think about the idea of a revelation that evolves with us. And because I think there's probably also fear on the other side that any amount of evolution is a corruption of the revelation, that like any amount of distance from whatever it originally meant is some sort of distortion that is us creating a rule that we would prefer to follow.
But look how the context has evolved. You can't help but let there's got to be a principle here that can apply across contexts. I mean, if the Lord gave
Mm.
this revelation today, the prohibitions might have been sugar. Hey, we like, but like it could
Right.
have it could name a bunch of things. It could name,
Wow.
highly processed foods. They
Mhm.
didn't have those at the time this revelation was given. They didn't have this abundance of sugar. They didn't have opioids. They didn't have Red Bulls.
Mhm.
They didn't have
Right.
even chemical fertilizers, pesticides, all those things. I mean, a lot of things that we have today, and just a super abundance of food. They basically at that time they knew where their food was coming from,
Yeah.
Right.
and their diet was pretty limited. I mean, you had certain grains, you had some fresh vegetables. They weren't, but it was very limited. Their produce section, if they had a
Wow.
grocery store, which they didn't, their produce section would have been very small. And so, what is the principle that we're supposed to infer
Yeah.
from what the Lord did tell us? That's
And I think
Yeah.
right now we're looking at it as a checklist of, okay, what the things we need to do to enter the temple, and not actually looking at it as treating our body like a temple. That the
Mm.
underlying principle is, how can we be a greater steward to our bodies? How can we, come closer to the Savior by, being as healthy as we possibly can, and by following the direction that was given on how to do that? Because I think that it does give us some understanding. We can all interpret it a different way, but it does tell us, like, hey, I've provided all of these foods on this earth and they are good for you, whether
Yeah.
it's whole grains, whether it's plants, like, and it does give us that direction. And so if we look at it in that lens, like, okay, here's a framework, then we can, combat whatever comes, whether it's, choosing substances where you feel like you can control and not, have jitters, or be overly anxious, or even have a food coma, something as simple as that. When
Mhm.
really treating our body like a temple, we're trying to really keep that revelation, make ourselves a holier place where we can receive revelation more easily.
and being in touch, being aware of what your body is telling you, uh, by what you're taking into your body. This whole process, embodiment, is supposed to be so central to Latter-day Saint theology, and I don't think we've made it central yet. And
Mm.
this one challenges us to do that. And then what do we end up doing? We end up, over 100 years, we end up boiling it down to basically a law of Moses
Yes.
interpretation of Section 89, right? It's kind of I mean, let's be honest about it. I think we actually all know this, right? Section 89 says more than what we've boiled it down to. When we say word of wisdom, what do we mean?
Right.
It's really
And
like, like it means those four things. I don't know. It means
Yeah.
those things that we can't. It means those don't. And it's a sort of Pharisaic interpretation that
Mhm.
has taken root over time. And you remember how Jesus reacted to that.
Mhm.
By the time Jesus came on the scene, there was all these rules for everything that you could eat and not eat. And of course, he sort of just he thought that was a lot of silliness and pointed that out. He was fond of pointing that out.
Well, and I think that, I love that example where Jesus came, and, there were so many rules around living the gospel at that time. And he was just like, hey, let's boil it down to, like, love God, love your neighbor, like, so what can we boil the word of wisdom down to? And how can you, because I love verse 4, where it talks about how the conspiring men in the last days, the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, but also even just the processed food industry. I love the book, The Dorito Effect. It talks about all the science that goes into making a Dorito so that you can't eat just one. Like, there's so much
Wow.
science behind that. And even deeper, if you really want to look at the bigger picture of being a steward on this earth, living in the last days, in order to consume the amount of animal products that we eat, there's concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, factory farming. And a lot of these animals who are in these factory farms are not able to fulfill the measure of their creation. They're like kept in crates that they can't turn around, or that the chickens can't spread their wings. They're not able to actually fulfill what they were created for. And I believe that goes beyond just being meat for us. And
Yeah,
so,
well,
yeah,
there's this line in the temple that fulfill the measure of their creation and have joy therein. Like
and
I
have
think about
joy.
animals, like animals actually having joy. I always wonder what animal joy is. You can see it with birds and, dogs and things like that.
Wow.
But like these animals like do experience or should in a
Mhm.
natural environment experience joy. Wow. But if you look at what we do to animals for our food industry, it's the thing we don't want to look at as we're eating that hamburger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
Well, and I can see how the thing about the law of Moses is that there's so much security there. Like in a lot of ways, you're just totally let off the hook. If you can do these four things perfectly, then it's like you can just set every other discomfort aside. And so it feels like what you're saying is that maybe the spirit of the law is going to introduce discomfort because there's nuance, like it's not crystal clear. And I think there's discomfort because it's not also like guaranteed validation that you're that you're checking the box perfectly. Like I
Yeah.
so understand the gift of that kind of security. There's no ambiguity. You just did it or you didn't. And so
Right.
there was
I'm
that, I
sure a
think.
lot of people are uncomfortable with this idea. Like this is a really disruptive way, I think, to read this section and start asking questions that are bigger than something so black and white like
Yeah, the
animal
gospel,
production.
Jesus's gospel made a lot of Pharisees very uncomfortable, and it made Jews, very uncomfortable because it was actually challenging them to evolve and transcend that
Yeah.
law. And so we have this perfect opportunity here, I think, with the word of wisdom to do exactly that. What is the gospel of Jesus Christ uh, experience and interpretation of, like, why does it
Yeah.
matter to us? What does it do in our souls? How can it help us with our understanding of these bodies that we're
Yeah.
told that these bodies are not just a laboratory, but we're to be embodied eternally, and only by being embodied eternally can we experience this fullness of joy. Well, so what does that mean, and how does that relate to what we take into our bodies and how we
Yeah.
relate to the food that we eat, and to nature more generally? I think it's all part of that. It's an invitation to those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And it,
Yeah.
it definitely is an invitation, and you do get blessings from it. I mean, this whole thing is a principle with a promise. We have greater treasures, even hidden treasures, greater knowledge, that it does take more. It does take being a little uncomfortable, maybe not eating exactly like everyone else who's around you. But when you do that, when you feel better in your body, when you have the energy, when you have the ability to have more crystal clear revelation from God, because it's so subtle. It's so subtle. Revelation is that still small voice. And sometimes we put too many things into our bodies that we are not able to hear that still small voice. And that's going beyond just drugs and alcohol. What
Yeah.
is it that we are missing out on? And it's just an
Yeah.
invitation. And I love that. And what I love, it's very rare that in the scriptures you hear the Lord say, like, it is pleasing unto me. And in the word of wisdom, we have that. He's not telling us you have to act this way. Like, you need to do this or else, it's just saying, oh, by the way, it is pleasing unto me.
Mm.
And so to really look at it as, okay, well, if it's pleasing unto God, maybe I should look a little bit deeper and dive more into this, not as a commandment, but as an invitation.
Mm.
Can I ask you, just both of you, if you were looking at the word of wisdom with fresh eyes, and I know this is something you've both spent a lot of time on, but can we just actually talk about what's in there? Because I went back to read and there were things that were not in there that I was positive I remembered. And there was a lot that I'm like, oh my gosh. So if you had fresh eyes and you were reading this section, what's the
Well,
actual counsel?
what I love about the word of wisdom is that it's actually a chiasmus. So a chiasmus, he tells you what is the most important thing out of everything. A chiasmus starts where like the very first part of the revelation is similar to the last. So at the very beginning, he talks about, this is a principle with a promise. And at the very end, he talks about the promise that is given, and then the middle part is pretty similar to like the second to last part. But right in the center, if this is a chiasmus, which is a literary structure, which tells you, to really focus on one thing, the simplest, easiest part. And that's actually going to be verse 10 and 11. So I'm going to go ahead and read it.
Right in the middle, because it's a 21 verse
Yeah,
chapter.
21 verses. So yeah, 10 and 11 is right in the middle. And it says, again, verily I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man. Every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, and all these to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. And so there's a couple different things here. So herbs, it can actually be expanded if you go into, the little subheading, what are herbs? And they're, 10A is defined as plants, so just any type of plant. So that's going to be fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes. And it talks about in the season thereof. And I've dived a lot into this. Like, what does that mean in our modern world? Because we can get anything, any time of the year. And what's fascinating to me is the American Gut Project, which was the largest research study done so far on the human gut microbiome, showed that if we consume a variety of plants, it's more about the variety of plants. So if you're eating in the season thereof, you're eating a variety. And those who consume variety had the healthiest gut microbiomes compared to anyone else, even if they ate meat, even if they had dairy, whatever it was.
Is there a little bit more to that? I wonder, because I sense that it's so great to live in a time when you can get stuff that's in season. So it's harvested in the season of the harvest, like it's at its peak in taste and nutrition. I happen to love arugula, and you can get arugula like when you get it fresh, and it has that like it's kind of spicy. I love the taste of arugula
Yeah.
right after I buy it. And about 4 or 5 days later, you taste it's not the same thing. You can tell like something is diminished in that. It tastes more bland, and then it starts to wilt a little bit. The early saints there weren't that many opportunities for them to eat something. They try to preserve it. You can and you preserve, but it's it's amazing to live in a day when we can get stuff from almost all over the world, and it gets to us so fast. Um, we live in a time when it's really fun actually to eat a plant-based diet because there's so many options. It's delicious.
Right.
So yeah.
And it is beneficial. Like even tomatoes, there's certain nutrients in tomatoes that help minimize sunburns. And so, if you are eating in the season thereof, it actually does help with the specific issues you're dealing with in that season.
Interesting.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
And 95% of Americans in this world, like 95% of us are not eating enough fiber, which is 25 grams for women, 35 grams a day for men. It's simple. It's not crazy high. It's nothing crazy and extreme. It's just simple.
I know that there's a lot of people that have settled on carnivore diets, and they're convinced, and there's pretty good data to support that, at least in the short term.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Keto diets are really, really healthy.
Great
And so you're
short
going to get
term.
a lot of people saying, oh yeah, plant-based, but I've got this keto thing and that's
Right.
working for me. And like, what's wrong with that?
There's one verse that seems confusing in this day and age, this day and age of carnivore and paleo. And that's verse 14 that says, all grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts. And I remember being in the temple, reading the word of wisdom, being like, but I've been told grain is terrible. But there was a meta-analysis, okay, of almost 1 million people, which like that science is strong. And they found that those who consume 10 grams more fiber than they're currently eating. So say you're eating 15 grams of fiber, you go up to 25. That those who did that decreased their risk of dying from all causes by 10%. Like that small and simple thing. Small and simple thing, and at the end, that promise where the destroying angel shall pass by them, that's a simple, easy thing. It's just to eat more plants. And when you're consuming complex carbohydrates, whole grains, when you're consuming these foods, your gut microbiome produces what's called short chain fatty acids. And short chain fatty acids are acetate, butyrate, propionate. And things like butyrate, which is one of them, is going to strengthen your gut lining. It's going to protect you. And it goes throughout your whole body. It helps reduce your risk of cancer, reduce your risk of heart disease. In fact, if you consumed whole grains every single day, you have a minimum, like it minimizes your risk of heart disease by 25%. It is a powerful nutrient-filled food when you're eating it in its whole form, not the refined form.
By the way, one of the questions that you have is like, first of all, when you go to like a largely plant-based diet, it seems like it's expensive and hard, right? It's going to cost more. How do I feed a family? Mostly plants. Like it's cheaper to buy refined carbohydrates, right? Like the food industry has provided all these like abundant and very unnutritious but inexpensive options for us. So one thing I love about what Allie does is she actually shows you how it's way easier than you think and can be way cheaper than you think. And you can also get your protein because that's a big deal for me. I got to get protein.
Yep.
I do a lot of like I exercise a lot. I feel like I wondered if I could get enough protein through plants, and so Allie's got a podcast on this and a YouTube channel that shows you like walks you through how to do this in really easy ways. I become kind of a big fan of what you're doing, Allie.
Thank you. No, I actually had the missionaries over on Sunday and I fed them lentil dal. Now, lentils are packed with protein. Like 1 cup, you have 18, 19 grams of protein. And the missionaries were like, this is so good. What are these? And I was like, oh, they're lentils. What do those look like? I like pulled them out. I'm like, these are lentils, and they're so good for you. They have tons of fiber and protein. And, I think that you don't have to have animal products with every meal in order to get your protein. There's so many other great sources. And you don't have to just choose, animal products or tofu. Like, beans are really great options. And they can even supplement, even just, make meat a little bit less prevalent on your plate and add more beans. Then you're getting the fiber on top of that. Yeah.
Okay, what about hot drinks? Hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. That's one of those, like, it feels so out of context. It feels to me like I don't know how it got attached to the very specific ways that we interpret it. I'd love to hear either of your thoughts.
There's a literal view on this, and if you research consuming hot drinks, literally hot drinks,
like temperature,
doing that regularly, it does increase your risk of throat cancer significantly, and or even digestive cancers.
Really?
Yeah, so there is evidence with that.
And at the time, there was a lot of discussion at the time this revelation was received. There was quite a bit. It wasn't the predominant view, but a significant view among medical experts that you just should avoid hot drinks. It was the temperature of the drink. It's not what was in it, it was the actual temperature. So you can imagine people reading this at the time and wondering, okay, well, I'm just not going to drink. I'm not going to drink those hot drinks. People would often boil water because water was sometimes it had bacteria. So hot drinks were common, and you get up to the boiling point, and then you wait for to cool down a little bit. But there was a pretty significant portion of people who were just avoiding hot drinks altogether because there was a theory that they were unhealthy for you. Yeah.
Right.
Then
what?
Then it became a matter of interpretation. Like, is there something? What was he talking about? Was there something in these hot drinks, these typical hot drinks that we drink, and I think even Hiram Smith began to gravitate to this idea that it's actually coffee and tea. That must be what the Lord was talking about, right? And so that became part of the discussion very early on, and eventually, it was decades later, it was sort of like nailed down. Okay, this has got to be coffee and tea. That had to be what they were talking about, and maybe it's the stimulant because um, uh, I think that's probably that, and that's a reasonable explanation. Maybe it's stimulating drinks that just, and when you drink too much caffeine or other stimulants, it can be sort of like disruptive. It can be really helpful at times. Like when you're groggy, sometimes you need a little bit of a stimulant, to get you through that day. And so we find various ways of doing that, don't we? People, especially now, uh, but it's always been the case. We're going to find a way to get that little hit because when your energy is flagging mid-afternoon, yeah.
Yeah. And so this one matters to me, I guess, because I'm well, for lots of reasons. I mean, I remember when our oldest was, it was like the stage where it feels like you have two babies, like a toddler and an infant. And I remember extreme exhaustion. And I just remember thinking, how can this be better than drugging myself with a stimulant? Like I need to be a present mother. Like I want to be that. And like what's the greater sin? And I think that is a question a lot of people are asking. It feels like a moral dilemma. And so
Right.
so I think there's pressure to interpret or reinterpret this particular part of the word of wisdom because it would sure help, it seems like, in
Right.
in parts of your life where your energy genuinely matters. And I think coffee and tea to me feel like kind of our sacred cow. It's like it's our community's sacred cows. And it seems like we're quick to trade without really examining what we're trading for. Like, could it really be better to be addicted to soda, but you never touch the coffee, which you could argue is more of a whole food. So I know that these are conversations that are happening, and I think there are some really legitimate desires there, not
Right.
just the hit where you get a little pep in your step at the end of the day, but I want to be able to read a story to my kid and I'm falling asleep and I'm grumpy. So
Mhm.
what is the solution here?
Well, the
Well,
solution is obviously tons of Diet Coke and
Yeah,
energy
swig.
drinks, two or three. Isn't it funny that like we've just found workarounds. Like
Yes.
I go to business meetings all the time, and there's like all these Mormon dudes in these business meetings just pounding stimulant drinks, right? It's like
Right.
it's way more than you can get with with coffee. It's pretty easy to make the argument that coffee is healthier than Diet Coke, right?
Right.
Nutritional science has kind of come a long way.
Yeah. In fact, for most Americans, they're getting most of their antioxidants from their coffee. In fact, that's that's
Really.
why it has been more health promoting. And I've struggled with this personally because green tea is honestly one of the healthiest. There's so much research. And so I took this to God. I was like, look, it would be nice to have a little bit of extra energy. Is there other options? Is it just green tea, or, black tea, green tea, coffee, or soda and energy drinks? Like, is this all we have? Because it seems like that's our only option. But when you actually do the research and considering verse 10, right, that we should be looking at wholesome herbs,
Mm,
we live in a modern society where we have access to amazing wholesome herbs that don't just give us that big spike of energy and then a crash down. That's the unfortunate side effect of coffee, of soda, is it gives us a lift, but then it brings us down pretty sharp. And there's other types of caffeine that have things like theobromine, which lift you up, but like gently bring you back down. And so nowadays we have
yeah.
access to things like yerba mate, and you can make that taste good in our modern society, which is great. Guayusa is probably the healthiest form of caffeine. Yupon, YAUPON, that's another really great source of caffeine that has the theobromine that lifts you up, but then gently brings you down. Cacao chocolate, honestly, is also not as strong, but it does give you a lift and it's full of these antioxidants. So there are other options that are
Interesting.
available to us that aren't as strong, but that treat our bodies better, honestly, so that
Mm,
will give you that lift, but you don't get the crash. So you can be more in tune with the spirit. And if we look at the word of wisdom beyond just the letter of the law and look at the spirit of the law and ask, could there be more?
mm.
Like I just want more energy, but I think like these are my only choices, but actually, is there a better way? Is there a better option than what I think are in front of me? And that's where things will unfold for you. There are better options than soda and energy drinks. There are options that don't have to be tea and coffee. And for, those members of the church, we should be, the best with herbs. There's so many things like adaptogens, like
Mm.
ashwagandha and, makaru, reishi mushrooms, like so many plants. We should be the experts on plants because they serve our body and God gave them to us, to help us, not just give us a little lift, but then a crash, but to support our bodies. Adaptogens are plants that basically help your body adapt to stress, don't increase your stress. So sometimes when you're
Okay.
drinking something like soda, yeah, it helps in the moment, but then it's going to increase your cortisol levels overall. Where if you're drinking more adaptogens, then it actually serves your body. It helps you so that you can adapt to the stress in your environment.
This is so interesting, Alec. This feels like such a good example of a like law of Moses versus gospel of Christ shift where I can see how you could I could disrespect my body, and I'm up till all hours of the night and or packing my schedule or, just like no respect for the actual needs and then feeling really justified about this absolute demand for a stimulant. And also, I think there's more flexibility probably than what feels comfortable when somebody hands you a checklist. But this is so much bigger than like what's in the cup. And
Mhm.
probably there's more exploration that could point you in a direction that feels wise and centered and feels like you're treating your body like a temple.
I think it's really interesting. A journalist named Laura Kelly, she published a piece in the Atlantic, and it's called "Coffee's Grip on America." And she said this is a quote, most American adults drink coffee regularly. The beverage is inescapable in America. By the way, in Mormon culture, we just substitute other stimulants, we energy drinks or whatever. But so we're not like we'd like to say, yeah, well,
Yeah.
talking about other
I
people.
wonder if like milligram per milligram where we compare. Like,
I
wouldn't that be
wonder. That'd be
so
interesting to know.
interesting?
Yeah.
I bet we give
Yeah.
him a run. I bet we give him a run for
I bet
sure.
so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's true.
He says, coffee is inescapable in America in part because it has enabled the long work hours that contribute to
Mm.
America's culture of productivity. As mega best-selling author Michael Pollan wrote in The Atlantic in 2020, quote, coffee has helped create exactly the kind of world that coffee needs to thrive. So, and
Wow.
this is a whole interesting discussion because you can argue that, the first really coffee consuming culture was the Arabica bean comes from the Arabs, right? So it was I think in like the 12th century when
Really?
Arabs started drinking coffee as a culture, and then the Ottoman Empire eventually emerged. There was like this flourishing of culture that was coincident with them starting
Wow.
to drink coffee, and then that same thing happened eventually in Europe in the 1650s when both coffee and tea and cacao were introduced to Europe. Drunkenness had been so common up to that time
Mhm.
that it was suppressing their culture. But when the stimulant drinks came on the scene, all of a sudden you see this flourishing of culture in Europe, and the Enlightenment eventually occurs. Like you could make a
Wow.
connection the, between these stimulant drinks and amping up the culture in a way, right?
Yeah.
We've done that to the nth degree in American culture. We're like
Yeah.
so stimulated now. And
Mhm.
there's a cost to that. I mean, there's a it's we're such a driven, high energy culture, high demand. We
Yeah.
overschedule. Like all of these things have a real spiritual cost, and it may have some direct connection to the amount of exogenous stimulants we're taking into our system.
Yeah.
So we ought to at least think about that and at least be aware of what they do in our bodies when we ingest these. That's I think central to our experience in this life.
Right.
Yeah, this is blowing my mind a little bit because I think we definitely also, I think we still hold productivity like a value in our community. In the state of Utah, especially, our symbol is the beehive, and we're proud of
Mhm.
that. And that there's more there. There's more about community, but I think there is this general sense that being very productive is good. And I love the
Yeah,
idea that
what a great energy drink brand, the Beehive. Somebody's going to remember
don't say it, Bill. But yeah, like that would I it would be so it's just like such an interesting thought that I don't examine that. It's taken for granted that it's good to get things done. And I love the idea that like how interesting would it be if we could sort of shift that value a little bit and value rest and value taking care of your body in a way that looks like you're not scheduling, being a mom, but also taking cookies and making Instagrammable dinners and going to a book club and piano lessons. And like so it's not the essentials necessarily that are exhausting a lot of times. I think that's the lie I tell myself. But I think the issue is this, that I'm scheduling every minute of the day until I crash. And so it's like there's only
Right.
one solution. And I love the idea that maybe that's where we need to start challenging our culture and just our the way we're scheduling our lives.
Yeah,
Well,
it doesn't mention sleep, does it? The organism doesn't mention sleep, but guess what? Like a few verses earlier in section 88, actually, it does talk about sleep, and it says, you know, uh, don't sleep longer than is needed. We never have that
Yeah.
problem now, but back then, like once the lights went out, like once the sun went down, sometimes up in New England, you'd have like 12 hours of darkness. So maybe sleeping too long was a little bit more of a thing, but it says, go to bed early and then
Mhm.
rise early that you'll be, what does it say? Like invigorated in body and mind, something like that. It's
Yeah,
like,
that your minds may be invigorated. Yeah, DNC 88, 124.
oh, read that, read that.
Says, cease to be idle, cease to be unclean, cease to find fault one with another, cease to sleep longer than is needful, retire to thy bed early, that ye may not be weary. Arise, hold on, you may not be weary. Arise early, that your bodies and your minds may be invigorated.
If
Yeah.
you've ever, I've gotten in the habit recently of greeting the sunrise, and I've always been a
Mhm.
night owl, so this is a hard transition to make. But getting up early and getting to bed a little earlier and getting up early and actually, there's we have some of us in our family. I have this thing where we go up the mountain and like sit on this top of this mountain and meditate, and then at the end of the meditation, the sun rises over and
Oh
it's
my, so
so
cool.
cool, it's so invigorating the way it makes you. The way
Amazing.
it starts your day and the way you feel, both mind and body. There's really something in this wisdom. So let's append that to 89. Let's just say it was right at the end of 88.
Draw the line
Part of it. But I
early.
think it is part of it. And I'm teasing a little bit about what I'm going to talk about at Restore. But the word of wisdom, the word wisdom, there's a lot of divine feminine in that. And the divine feminine, just femininity, is all about receiving. It's not about productivity, it's about receiving. And so how can we receive more instead of just go go go, push push push? There is deeper wisdom in this if we
Yeah.
go beyond.
Yeah.
Mm.
We probably need to start wrapping up, but one other part of this conversation that I think is really important, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about, are the ways that our interpretation right now, this like very fixed interpretation of the word of wisdom, may be creating some unnecessary cultural issues. Bill, you write about specific examples that are so uncomfortable, like it makes you cringe a little bit, and also it's heartbreaking sometimes what we ask of other cultures to give away kind of flippantly.
Yeah, there's two things that we maybe could touch on. One is as we become a global church, we're taking this revelation that was given in early 19th century America 200 years ago in a specific context, and
Hmm.
we're superimposing it onto a world. And anybody that's been a missionary knows what uh, the challenges of this, right? And it's particularly in certain cultures. I think we should also talk about generationally. Like um,
Mm.
we've got a different generational culture now, and it's a culture that's not just young people are not just doing things because you tell them to. You got to make a better case for why you're doing it. And so if you're not able to make that case, young people are just making their own decisions. Just walk around Utah County or anywhere, and because we need to be able to make a case for the why is really important. And as you're taking the gospel to, I served in Italy, for example, it was difficult to tell to sit in front of a family who they use wine. They don't abuse alcohol. I mean, very few people, you almost never see public drunkenness. They drink enough alcohol to give them like a little bit of so their conversations around the dinner table, they're just a little bit freer. There's a really nice flow to conversation and to relationships. So it's a little bit of a social lubricant. That's kind of how it's used there.
Hmm.
But it's more than that because they actually do grow their own wine. You know, it's hard to make the case to these people that it's a moral sin not to drink wine, as they say, well, Jesus drank it. Not only did Jesus
Yeah.
drink it, he knew good wine from bad wine, and so do we. Like we know, like he drank it enough to know that there was such a thing as fine wine, and not, but so it was difficult to make a case to the Italians, but not impossible that that they should give up wine. They look at you and they like, you've been talking to me about faith and hope and charity and the atonement of Jesus Christ. What does this have to do with any of that? And
Hmm.
it is challenging sometimes to make that case. I often wondered as a missionary, like, why are we? I wish we could be a little bit less rigid because it felt like a stumbling block. So that's tough. If you go to my brother David served in Japan, and he had to tell people that do these tea ceremonies. There's these beautiful Japanese tea ceremonies. They're very ritual. They're very like spiritual and grounding, and they didn't have some casual relationship with tea. Like it was part of their culture that went back hundreds, thousands of years.
And
Can't
in their own families, right? Like families will have these traditions that they're passing to their children and their children. And it's so uncomfortable to imagine walking in and saying, God said no.
It is. It's tough. I mean, surely we can be more thoughtful about that, like aware of what we're asking people, because sometimes we're asking them to give up something that's deeply meaningful to them and that connects them with people and is not, in fact, a sin.
Yeah.
A sin. Alcohol has always been a problem. Noah was found drunken and naked in his tent. Like, yeah, we should be really careful about alcohol. And I kind of like that we've just drawn that line because we've avoided
Right. Right.
so much
Well,
social pathology.
I
Yeah.
think with a lot of this too, when it's like, how do we actually embody it? I really love looking at the Seventh-day Adventists, actually. Their
Mm.
church was started around the same time as our church. And they ended up moving out west just like we did. They actually moved to Loma Linda, California, where we, went to the Salt Lake Valley. They look at health as part of discipleship. So it's not a checklist, it's something you embody. They build hospitals. That's like part of their church's divine mission. Health is part of discipleship, and because of that, they don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke tobacco. And what's fascinating is most of them actually don't even eat meat either, and they don't drink coffee and tea. So they have a very, very similar health code. And what's also interesting is if you look at blue zones, so Dan Buettner wrote a book called Blue Zones, where he went through the whole world and tried to find pockets of the world where people live to be 100 years old and older, and where are there the most centenarians. And they were in Costa Rica, they were in Okinawa, Japan. We just talked about Italy. There's all of these different parts in the world, and there is one pocket in the United States. And unfortunately, it's not Salt Lake City or Provo,
Okay.
Utah. It's actually Loma Linda, California, where the Seventh-day Adventists live, because they have embodied health, and they're not even perfect. Like I have a client who is Seventh-day Adventist, and I'm like, so do you avoid coffee every single day? And she's like, oh, I've had some occasionally, but like I really don't. I try not to.
Mm.
And so it's not asking for perfection, but it's trying to be the best you can and really live that higher law as part of your discipleship.
That's beautiful. And we're so excited you're going to be back to talk more about this, Allie, at Restore. I want to close with this. This is a principle with a promise. And what do you think we actually have that we can offer the world with after all of this conversation and ways we want to re-examine this revelation? What's at the heart of it that we have to offer?
Oh, that is such a great question. I wish that as a missionary, I had been going out in the world and actually featuring the word of wisdom as this invitation into embodiment and embodied experience and being conscious and aware of what we're taking into our bodies with gratitude
Mm.
and yeah, inviting us into a deeper relationship with God through this deeper relationship with our bodies. And I think it could be, I think that's actually, and we have that opportunity now. We should be doing it now. We have this remarkable revelation that could be an invitation to the world instead of like that last discussion you give them, that, oh, this, you're gonna have to do these, not do these four things. We really do have something remarkable to offer the world if we learn to live it ourselves. It would move it from stumbling block to
Mm.
invitation.
And I absolutely love verse 18, and I'm just going to read it. It says, and all saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments, shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones. So we hear that. We've heard that phrase before. And if you think about, we've been looking at this as a way to enter the temple, to receive that type of blessing, or we can look at it as making ourselves that temple and automatically receive that type of blessing. That it doesn't have to be, waiting and just the checklist, but really we can have the temple blessings within our body by following this and embodying it completely.
Oh my gosh. Thank you both so much. This is so powerful and feels exciting because it's one of those things that's been here all along, that's at our fingertips, that I think there's a real hunger to lean into now. So thank you. Thank you. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Bill Turnbull and Ali Essig. Ali will be joining us at Restore this year, so if you'd like to hear more, make sure to get your tickets at faithmatters.org. And if you're interested in any of the resources that Ali mentioned, you can see those in the show notes or also on the website. All right, thanks again for listening.